Welcome back. In our last lecture, we talked about 2 of 4 major concepts in classical rhetoric, and these concepts were invention and arrangement. As you probably remember, invention is the process of figuring out what you can write about in a given situation or in relation to a particular topic or question. And when you're starting to think about a piece of writing, it may seem silly to actually stop and ask yourself the basic question, what can I say about this topic, issue, or question? Most likely you have something in mind, or you wouldn't be writing anything. But sometimes calling our attention back to the most basic questions or issues, like, what can I say about this, helps us to focus so that we can move forward and produce a really engaging piece of writing. The other term we talked about was arrangement, and this is pretty much just what it sounds like. It's the process of choosing which things to include in your writing and which order you want to put them in. You want to arrange the elements of your writing so that they are the most effective they can be in any given situation. You'll pick and choose which elements to include and the order and style in which you treat them based on how you deal with the issue of invention. Now, again, arrangement seems like a really basic concept and one that you maybe don't even have to consciously think of. Of course you're going to arrange your writing, but you don't just want to throw a jumble of words or ideas on the page and hope that someone can figure out your main point. Okay, I take that back. I have seen some pieces of writing that seem to have followed this model of organization, but you don't want to do that. And again, returning your focus to a very basic question like, how do I arrange and present this stuff, can help make it better. As we've already discussed, these terms and others, like kairos, come from the world of classical rhetoric, from the ancient Greek and Roman worlds, where good public speaking and persuasive writing were actually considered art forms. The Greeks and the Romans were almost fanatical in the way they broke things down into steps, the way they gave certain elements of their writings categories or labels that probably wouldn't even occur to us to even try and name. And they were famous also for the rigorous and dedicated way they studied and tried to master these concepts. And you're probably asking, so just what does that have to do with me and writing in the modern world? Well, as I've already pointed out, some of the most compelling writers we've studied in this course, particularly Benjamin Franklin and Frederick Douglass, were actually students of classical rhetoric. And as you may recall, Douglass in particular treasured his copy of The Columbian Orator, which he had managed to purchase when he was 12 years old. Douglass famously said in an interview, "Every opportunity I got, I read this book." The Columbian Orator was a foundational text in the schools of early America, and it contained lots of speeches and argumentative pieces that employed the techniques of classical rhetoric. Children were supposed to study and try to imitate the pieces in this text with the idea that through practice and imitation, they could master these concepts. And you'll have to admit, in the case of writers like Franklin and Douglass, this seems to have worked rather well. Their writing is compelling, it's engaging, it's persuasive, it's all the things you want to be in your own writing. So logically, if studying classical rhetoric worked so well for them, surely it can work for us too. And as I've already mentioned, although you're learning terms like kairos, invention, arrangement, etc., and in this lecture we're going to study 2 more, ethos and pathos, you never need to actually use those words in your own writing. I find it helpful simply to have a Post-it note on my computer that lists these words so that my attention's brought back to them. It's a reminder that I should pause and consider how anything I'm working on uses these concepts and whether or not I'm using them effectively. Again, it's all about being intently mindful or hyper-aware of what's going on in your own writing so that you can make it the best it can be. So as I said, last time we talked about 2 of 4 key terms, and those 2 were invention and arrangement. In this lecture, we're going to focus and analyze another 2 rhetorical concepts, and these are ethos and pathos. These ideas are particularly useful in writing situations where you're attempting to persuade somebody to give you something, like job application letters or grant proposals. You'll learn different ways to establish ethos, and this in a nutshell means simply the perception that readers have of your reliability or character. And we're also going to look at some methods for inspiring pathos. And pathos really means simply inspiring emotion in your readers, especially feelings of sympathy. A quick note here, pathos, spelled P-A-T-H-O-S, is sometimes pronounced pathos, but most scholars of rhetoric say pathos. It's a similar case with one of the writers we've been discussing in this course, Henry David Thoreau. Some scholars insist that his name should be pronounced Thoreau. Whichever way you decide to say pathos or Thoreau, you'll be pleasing some people and you'll be irritating others. Just pick whichever you prefer and go with it and don't worry about it. So to get back to ethos and pathos, careful use of each of these ideas can greatly increase the chances that your written request for something will meet with success rather than rejection. As I suggested just a moment ago, ethos is a term that in the most general sense refers to the character and the credibility of the person making an argument, while pathos is a term that in the most general sense refers to the emotional aspects, or what we would call the affective qualities of an argument. Now, when I introduce these two concepts to my students, I begin by asking them if they've seen those late-night TV programs that feature images and narratives or stories about impoverished children in developing countries. And those ads usually then ask viewers to send money to sponsor a child or contribute something to help fight hunger or disease. Most of my students in the class, when I ask them about this, they say, yeah, we've seen these programs. I then ask them to raise their hands if they've actually sent a check or if they've made a donation. A few hands usually go up, and usually it's somewhere in the realm of maybe 2 or 3 people in a class of about 35. I tell the ones who say that they've sent in money that I admire them for it. They're good people. I tell the other students that I don't judge them negatively, since I consider this to be an issue of individual choice, and absolutely everyone has the right to say no without being criticized or condemned for it, and least of all, by me. But I then tell them that I've never written a check in response to one of those pleas from the people on television. But I also say I have written checks for similar groups in response to requests from people that I know. So, for example, I have some friends who've done volunteer work fighting poverty and disease, like in those places we see on TV. I have some friends who work for Doctors Without Borders. And I say to my class that the reason I write checks for people I know is that they have a kind of built-in ethos with me. They have credibility because I know them, I trust them, and I know exactly what kind of work they've been doing. And it's not, let me be clear, it's not that I distrust the people on TV. It's just that they haven't offered the combination of ethos and pathos that I find really persuasive. Now, if you think about it, obviously the pathos is definitely there. How could images of starving children not arouse feelings of sympathy or make you have a desire to help? But the pathos that's inspired by those images is not effective if I really don't know much about the person or the group that's showing me these images and asking me for my money. That's why some of these charity organizations get celebrity spokespeople to help them make their pleas. And the idea is something like, if I see actress Charisma Charming make this request, and I like Ms. Charming's movies, and I like what I've learned about her from reading magazine articles, etc., then the thinking goes, I'll be more inclined to donate money because she has an established positive ethos, at least for me. And I'm not at all suggesting here that these organizations are trying to trick me in some way by using celebrity spokespeople. In most instances, almost all these organizations are really doing fantastic work. And what they're doing by getting celebrities to speak for them is simply employing a strategy from classical rhetoric, whether or not they actually know that that's what they're doing. And they're doing this in order to get me to help them out. There's absolutely nothing wrong with this, and there's a whole lot that's right about it as long as it's done ethically and responsibly. Okay, but let's take another example. I imagine that almost every one of us has gotten an email from someone claiming to be in charge of a bank account in Nigeria. This email usually begins something like, "Dearest one," and then a hard luck tale follows, and then the writer usually says something like, "If you'll just help me access this account worth $5 million US, I'll give you a cut. So just send me your account number and then we'll be good to go." Other emails of this type claim to be from people who have an illness, or they've got a family member who is sick or recently deceased, and they either need help paying for medical bills, or else they need, for some reason it's always your bank account number, but they need your bank account number in order to help them access, say, an inheritance. Okay, how would you describe the ethos connected with these emails? I tend to think of the word sketchy when I think of emails like this. I don't know anything about the writer. They don't seem to have any idea who I am. They never use my real name. And I've got no way of verifying their identity or checking on their situation. Now, let's consider, what if I got an email from a friend of mine who happens to be in Nigeria, and this friend is there, say, working with an organization like Doctors Without Borders? Well, if she says that she needs my help with a financial matter, I am much more likely to offer help, and this is because she has established an ethos as someone who is reliable, trustworthy, and working for a noble cause. What goes wrong with these emails from unknown sources, among a whole list of things that are wrong with them, but one thing that goes wrong is that they are heavy on the pathos but light on ethos. There's nothing intrinsically ethically or morally problematic with just simple pathos-based appeals, but as a general rule, attempts to persuade are much more successful when they combine pathos and ethos, and usually they're successful if they emphasize the ethos instead of the pathos. So let me just say that again. The most successful attempts combine ethos and pathos, and they're usually most successful if the ethos is sort of the dominant element rather than the pathos. You can give me the most pathetic, in the kind of classical rhetorical sense of the word, the most pathetic argument ever, but if I don't trust the ethos, it's not going to get you very far. Okay, so how do you establish ethos? Well, generally speaking, ethos is established through habits or patterns of behavior. Figures in the public eye, people like celebrities or politicians, they have established an ethos based on what's widely known about their actions, about their words in interviews, publicity about their charity work, their statements about positions on certain issues, etc., etc. All of this works together to create an ethos. And that's all fine and good, you might be saying, but how do I construct an ethos in a piece of writing if the audience doesn't actually know me personally? Well, in this case, what you have to do is demonstrate knowledge and expertise, and/or you've got to speak from a position of authority in the writing itself. And in order to make whatever your writing is about, have the greatest pathetic appeal, and again, I'm using pathetic here in the classical sense, not the sort of common everyday way we use it nowadays, you need to establish your ethos fairly early on. And if you're trying to figure out how to balance ethos and pathos, less pathos, as I've said before, is usually better than more. Okay, so let's look at an example of an attempt to persuade readers to do something that models a mix of ethos and pathos. In this case, we're going to return to Frederick Douglass's narrative. It's a text that's intended in its broadest terms to persuade its audience to support the abolition of slavery. In the first part of the quote I'm about to read to you, Douglass establishes his ethos, his authority to speak on this subject. This is what he says. Quote, "I have no accurate knowledge of my age, never having seen any authentic record containing it. By far, the larger part of the slaves know as little of their ages as horses know of theirs, and it is the wish of most masters within my knowledge to keep their slaves thus ignorant. I do not remember to have ever met a slave who could tell of his birthday. They seldom come near to it then, planting time, harvest time, cherry time, springtime, or fall time." Okay, so how does he establish his ethos and his right to speak on the matter of slavery at all? Well, obviously, first and foremost, there's the fact that he was a slave, and this in and of itself certainly makes him qualified to speak on the subject. But this, of course, is an aspect of ethos beyond anyone's control. It just simply is. But here, when it comes to the particular matter of slaves knowing personal information like their own ages or their birth dates, he goes ahead and establishes himself as someone who has paid close attention to this issue specifically, and thus he's someone who has a right to comment on it. So Douglas establishes ethos by providing some specific information. He tells us how slaves reckon or remember their birthdays, and this is usually in terms of seasons. And his language here indicates that he has asked numerous slaves if they know their birthdays. So this means that he's done a little research into the matter. His language here also suggests that while his personal experience absolutely is the key part of the establishment of his authoritative ethos and his right to speak on this topic, what we get from this passage is the sense that he has looked beyond merely his personal experience. He's inquired about slaves and their relationship to their personal information. He says at one point, "It is the wish of most masters within my knowledge." And he also says, "I do not remember to have ever met a slave." So he presents himself as a source of information on slaveholding culture whose authority is based both on first-hand personal experience and on further investigation and inquiry. And notice there how carefully he qualifies his statements. He does not come out and say, "All masters do this," or "Not a single slave knows his or her birthday." He's quite careful to put bounds or limits around his authority to speak. He acknowledges that there's some sort of outer limit to his knowledge, and this further enhances his ethos. He's cautious, he's reliable, and he does not claim to know things that he can't know. This balance of humility with authority is part of what makes his writing so powerful and also so persuasive. So that's the establishment of ethos, and I think we can agree that Douglas does a pretty good job of this. He then continues on to work some pathos into this passage by saying, quote, "A want of information concerning my own birthday was a source of unhappiness to me even during childhood. The white children could tell their ages. I could not tell why I ought to be deprived of the same privilege. I was not allowed to make any inquiries of my master concerning it. He deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent, and evidence of a restless spirit. The nearest estimate I can give makes me now between 27 and 28 years of age. I come to this from hearing my master say, sometime during 1835, I was about 17 years old." Okay, what is your first reaction to this portion of the passage? Probably some of you registered feelings of shock, of outrage, of sympathy. But what makes this so pathetically powerful is that Douglas takes what I think we could all agree is a relatively understated tone. He offers a matter-of-fact discussion of slaveholding culture's practice of keeping slaves ignorant of such basic personal information as birth dates and ages. And when he does this, he doesn't pile on negative adjectives. And he doesn't even really describe or characterize the practice as directly and specifically as he could have. He could have said, "This was cruel," or he could have said, "My master yelled in anger whenever I asked." But instead, he keeps the tone calm. The lack of this knowledge, he says, is a source of unhappiness. It's very understated, a source of unhappiness. He's confused as to why he can't know this information, and we get a very circumspect description of his master's attitude. Douglas is simply, as he puts it, quote, "not allowed to make any inquiries." His master, quote, "deemed all such inquiries on the part of a slave improper and impertinent." Again, this really seems like understatement if we think about everything we know about slaveholding culture. So the understatement Douglas uses here allows us to imagine the reality as somewhat more unpleasant. And he does not come across as trying to prey on our sympathies. He presents the facts straightforwardly, and most readers will feel sympathy for his situation. Why can't a slave even know his or her own birthday? Of course he doesn't understand why one group of children could know their birth dates and another group would be ignorant of this information for no other reason than the color of their skin. Now, in order to really appreciate and recognize this understatedness, what we have to remember is that Douglas is speaking to an audience of mostly white Northerners who, while interested in the question of abolition, might have had little to no knowledge of actual slaveholding culture. Douglas was really strongly aware of the need to introduce them to the nature of slaveholding culture, but he needed to do that as carefully and as judiciously as possible. And the concern here is that his audience might become so emotionally overwhelmed by the description of the horrors of slavery that they would just stop listening. So remember those commercials featuring starving children I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture? Well, how many of us have turned the channel when they come on simply because they're so upsetting? The horrors of starving children, just like the horrors of slavery, are really hard to see or to hear about. And for Douglas, perhaps even worse than the possibility of overwhelming his audience so much that they just stopped listening would be if they listened and thought his story was so incredible that it couldn't possibly be true. In other words, Douglas has to take care so that his audience does not disbelieve him. At the same time, he also recognizes that pathos is a powerful tool for persuading his audience to join the anti-slavery movement. So what he's doing here is really walking a very, very fine line. He wants to draw them in, he wants to educate them about slavery, but he doesn't want to make them leave the room or turn the channel, as it were, because they're so overwhelmed by that story. I once heard a Holocaust survivor, Rose Van Tyne, speak of her experiences. The horrors she described were emotionally wrenching for her audience, but I was struck by how, while she detailed what happened to her in various concentration camps, there was one about which she said, "And that, I cannot even talk about what happened there." And then she waved her hand as if to brush it away, and she went on with the rest of her story. And make no mistake, the things that she actually did describe were truly horrific. Now, I'm guessing that certainly Mrs. Van Tyne was not concerned so much with how we, her audience, would react to this moment, as much as she was aware that this something that she didn't want to speak about, this something was so horrible, she couldn't even tell it to others without causing herself excessive pain. But the fact remains that when she did this, it has a similar effect, intentional or not, to Douglas's restraint that he demonstrates in his own work. Until her death this year at the age of 88, Mrs. Van Tyne regularly spoke to groups about her experiences in the Holocaust. So clearly, it was important to her that people were aware of what had happened and that people did not forget.
And when we came in Auschwitz, in ghetto cars, the Hitler's elite, the SS, were waiting for us. And they literally beat all the older people out of the killer car. And they were put in a row. I was put with another 100 women between the ages of 18 and 45. And we were set apart. The other people went by truck to the guest chambers. But they didn't know. We didn't know there were guest chambers.
It was certainly hard to listen to, and I have no doubt that it was also hard for her to relive these experiences over and over and over. Rose Van Tyne had an amazing ethos, and it was made all the stronger by the things that she did not say, by the moments when she held back, and also by the fact that in the midst of an account of humanity's darkest days, she still found a way to work in some humor and jokes. I remember her laughing when she related how after the war, she and her husband came to the United States after being sponsored by a family in Shreveport, Louisiana, and this family owned a pipe company. They were allowed to immigrate to the U.S. because this family had guaranteed her husband a job, and when they arrived, they were surprised to discover that the company did not make pipes for smoking, but pipes for plumbing. They had assumed that he'd be working in a pipe factory that would make pipes that people smoked.
But like I said, we were very blessed to come to Shreveport and to America. And we couldn't come, I told you that this country made a special law for Holocaust survivors. And Louis was a diamond cutter in Holland. And here he went into the pipe business, oil pipe. We thought in our papers it said pipes. And we thought it was smoking pipes.
By the end of her talk, Mrs. Van Tyne had managed to brilliantly mix ethos and pathos so that the audience regarded her as an authority, absolutely, and her words had considerable weight.
We bought this house in South Broadmoor, and all the neighbors came, and they brought coffee, and they brought cake, and I was so surprised. And we are still very good neighbors, except for one who doesn't like Jews. Too bad. I can change. And why should I change?
So when someone asked her if she missed her homeland, if she ever felt like she wanted to leave the United States and return home to Europe, to the Netherlands, which had originally been her home, she said, and I remember this so clearly, she said, no, because this is the greatest country in the world. It may not be perfect, but if something is wrong, you are allowed to speak up and say something about it. Now, if we can imagine, say, a 17-year-old born in North Dakota who spends part of his childhood in New York and part of his childhood in Texas, if this hypothetical 17-year-old said something similar, how persuasive would his statement be? I mean, he may be totally sincere and he may be perfectly correct, but does it have the same effect as Mrs. Van Tyne making the same statement? Well, you're all thinking, I hope, of course not. And if Mrs. Van Tyne had opened her talk with a comment about how great the United States is, rather than concluding with it, would it have been as powerful a statement? Well, not quite. It's because the account of her experiences established her as an authority on the Holocaust and its aftermath, giving her a compelling ethos. And it's because the events she relates definitely create pathos. It's because of this ethos-pathos combination that her concluding remarks about the United States of America being the greatest country in the world are powerful, compelling, and persuasive. Now, I'm guessing, and I'm also hoping, that most of us don't have personal situations similar to Frederick Douglass and Rose Van Tyne. While their examples really drive home how the ideas of ethos and pathos work, you don't need to have lived through a horrible situation in order to establish a compelling ethos, nor do you need to recount horrific events in order to get a pathetic response from your audience. Let's take something as simple as a letter to your local city council requesting the installation of a speed bump in your neighborhood. What kind of ethos and pathos do you get from the following letter? Dear City Council, I'm writing to request the installation of a speed bump on Main Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue. Cars drive too fast through this neighborhood, and it's only a matter of time before someone's pet or kid gets hit. How's the ethos and pathos here? Well, it's a good attempt at getting a pathetic response. Certainly, the idea of pets or children getting hit by cars draws on the reader's sympathies and emotions. But this falls short, mostly because there's no compelling ethos. In fact, there's not even really an ethos at all. We don't know why this person wants a speed bump, beyond the obviously stated reason, and we don't know if he or she lives in the neighborhood, or how long this person has lived there, or whether or not they know something about traffic engineering. With just a few tweaks, the ethos, and thus the letter as a whole, can be improved. Consider this rewrite of the letter. Dear City Council, as a longtime resident of Friendlyville, I'm writing to call your attention to a traffic situation. As you know, the closure of Concord Street and rerouting of traffic along Main has caused an increase in cars traveling down this street. As a 25-year resident of 1234 Main, I've witnessed this increase firsthand, and I have also seen the average speed of cars traveling this street increase. In the last month alone, I have witnessed 5 near misses between pets and cars, and 1 instance in which a child narrowly avoided being hit by a car. I'm writing to suggest that the installation of a speed bump on Main between 1st and 2nd Avenue would help slow traffic and potentially save lives. Thank you. What's the difference? Well, the writer tells us where he lives, how long he's had the experience of living on this street, he's got a knowledge of traffic patterns in the area, and he gives a first-hand report of some close encounters between pets, people, and cars. With that authoritative ethos established, his pathetic plea that the installation of a speed bump could save lives is much more effective than it otherwise would be. So, what you can take away from today's lecture is an understanding of how ethos and pathos can work together, and how it's usually more effective to have more ethos than pathos to make a really compelling piece of writing. An awareness of the elements of classical rhetoric that we've covered in this lecture and the 2 before it can help you become a better writer simply by calling your attention back to what we might call the basics of good writing. You may never use the words kairos or ethos or any of the others, but knowing and understanding them will definitely be a benefit. In today's lecture, we spent a considerable amount of time discussing how to establish yourself as an authoritative voice in your writing by focusing on certain concepts. In our next 2 lectures, we're going to get down to the nuts and bolts of setting yourself up as an authority by focusing on the process of conducting research.